Hello, Bible readers. I'm back. You might know I'm Jason Stanton. I serve as pastor at First Lutheran in Onalaska, Wisconsin, and during the COVID shutdown, I offered a year-long online survey of the whole Bible. You can probably find it where you have found this post. Every weekday for a year, I, along with something like 50 people, it's hard to know exactly how many people, but many of them completed a lifelong goal that they had, which was to read the entire Bible from front to back. So that was cool. And since then, I have continued the Bible Readers Project, going from that survey to doing more of a deep dive on Genesis. And I enjoyed that study so much. I've been still thinking about how much more important the characters in Genesis are to Christian ministry than almost all Christians give it credit for. But now having done Genesis, I'm really excited to move into Exodus. To study Exodus, I'm going to be reading Walter Brueggemann's two-part book series called Delivered Out of Empire. And then part 2 is Delivered into Covenant. So those are the two parts. Part 1 gets us through the first 15 chapters of Exodus, from the cry that begins history. You may know that cry. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Their cry for help rose up to God. So part 1 will take us from that cry that begins history all the way through the Song of Moses, when Israel faithfully proclaims that the Lord will reign forever and ever, which is quite a thing to say, when not so long before all that, it seemed that Pharaoh was in charge and that their slavery would last forever and ever. Part 2 then moves away from what they were delivered from, and it instead moves into what are we saved for, you could say. And so that part 2 will dwell deeply in God's gifts of grace and mercy, from manna in the wilderness to a completed tabernacle for the Lord. Israel is delivered into a covenant, a relationship grounded in promises. So for this Exodus study, I plan to post 25 times, 5 to 10 minutes each weekday for the next 5 weeks. This study should appear on First Lutheran's Facebook feed and our YouTube channel. And I'd really appreciate if you told a friend or share it, especially this first one. Share it on your Facebook or share it however you share things. But yeah, if you think this is worth someone's devotional time over these next few weeks, post-Easter or whenever you're looking at this, let a friend know. I just figured in the wake of Easter, freshly reminded of God's resurrection gift to us, I thought it would be a perfect time to dive into an even older story that's really just a variation on the same new life theme that we Christians celebrate with the story of Jesus' victory over death. So with that said, I want to say a word about the way Walter Brueggemann takes on Exodus. He doesn't just review each chapter like a scriptural commentary, although he has done a commentary on Exodus, of course. But in these books that I lifted up before, he highlights pivot points. What is a pivot point in Scripture, you might wonder? Well, Brent Strawn wrote the foreword to these books, and he lifts up a perfect example in the 22nd Psalm. And I'm actually recording this on Maundy Thursday. I just got done reading the 22nd Psalm, and I was reminded as I was reading it, there's a pivot point. For the first 21 verses, and actually, why don't you pause me and look up the 22nd Psalm? Or try to remember if you think you can. For the first 21 verses, Psalm 22 is desperate. I am poured out like water. I can count all my bones. Deliver my life from the power of the dog. Like, desperate. And then here's verse 21. Save me from the mouth of the lion. And the rest of that verse says, from the horns of the wild oxen, you have rescued me. And then the rest of the psalm says things like, stand in awe of the Lord, for he did not hide his face from me. I shall live for him. So like what? That 21st verse goes from save me, desperation, to you have rescued me, with no explanation between those thoughts or those feelings. Something happened, something drastic happened, something pivotal took place between the first part of verse 21 and the second part of verse 21. And here's the thing, we as readers or as listeners, we're supposed to notice that. And then imagine what that reality must have been like for the psalmist. How does the psalmist jump from the first half of verse 21 to the second half of verse 21? These moments, some phrases in Scripture, these pivot points are to be noticed and then wondered about. Strawn says such phrases are powerful instruments of awakening and recollection for all of us. They're meant to wake us up and to help us remember, not just other stories in Scripture, but help us remember our own stories. Like there was that time I went from desperation to hope-filled, and what was in between that moment for me. Pivotal texts are ones that arrest us, that is, stops us in our tracks, and demand our attention, and then change everything. Suddenly, there will be healing, as happens in Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 16 to 17. Suddenly, there's deliverance in this 22nd Psalm I just recounted. And there can also be, it's not always sudden good stuff. Sometimes it's sudden trouble or sudden judgment. 2 Samuel has examples of each of those. And here's my favorite thing that Strawn says about all this. These pivotal moments in Scripture are not acts of faith, but places of faith, established sites where the Spirit has already met the faithful. There are gifts already given in these places, though they seem largely still waiting on us to receive them. The goal of this book, he says, is to share those gifts. And then he says we are fortunate to have Professor Brueggemann lead the way. So here's my promise. I'm going to promise to try not to mess up Professor Brueggemann's book. You are welcome to order a copy and read it for yourself. But I mean for this online posting for these next 5 weeks to be a way to consider these books if you're not reading them for yourself, or if you are, but to consider the questions that these pivot points rise up in us. So I hope you enjoy this biblical sightseeing journey that we're going to be on together. These moments are sites that are a bit off beaten paths. Like you'll know the story that they're coming from, but perhaps you've never noticed the pivot point itself. Stick with me and we'll explore these spots together. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.